Of record-setting job losses here in Canada for April, the first full month of the economic shutdown in the COVID-19 crisis. And there are staggering new unemployment numbers as well in the United States, the economy Canada is most closely tied to. So in-depth coverage for you right now from two of our familiar business faces, senior business correspondent Peter Armstrong in Toronto. Just stand by for a second. Peter, Scott Peterson with me in the CBC newsroom. And Scott, I'll get to you in just a second for the American picture. But Peter, let's just dive in with the Canadian numbers. Decimation, devastation. March was bad. April, twice as bad.
Yeah, I was saying earlier, these numbers are so big that they're almost hard to get your head around. We lost 1 million jobs in March, 1 million jobs. Now we're into April. We lost 2 million jobs, more than 3 million Canadians completely out of work. And that doesn't even fill out the entire picture. StatsCan is saying that more than 2.5 million Canadians on top of that weren't working, at least were working less than half the hours they would normally work. And one in a quarter of those fear they might lose their jobs, most of them working in homes that they're having a hard time paying the bills. So when you add them all together, we're looking at more than 3 million people have lost their jobs completely, another 2.5 million Canadians not working half the hours they would normally work. And again, Heather, we talked about this, that this catches up to what I think we've seen in our communities, in our towns, in our cities across the country, but it does confirm just how deep this is. I mean, the worst we had ever seen in Canada, you got to go back to 1982, and in that we lost 600,000 jobs, 610,000 jobs over 17 months. Here we've lost 3 million in 2 months. It's just staggering.
And an unemployment rate of 13%. So those are the figures that we've just come out. So let us look to the future. I mean, we knew after March that April would be worse, but now we're starting to see the provinces begin to reopen. We've seen the federal government start to soften the blow and hopefully, with the wage subsidy, keep people on the payroll. Let's look to the future about what comes now.
Right. And the reason this matters is as the economies reopen and as things get back to quote unquote normal, we'll hopefully see a lot of those jobs begin to get, a lot of those people who lost their jobs begin to get rehired. The problem with that is if the economies open more slowly than we had expected, if people aren't going out to restaurants and cafes or going out to the movies or buying things in shops and just being a little bit more frugal, then those jobs are going to come back more slowly. And then the economy is going to recover more slowly. And it's all very intertwined. And we look at what these numbers tell us today. All of March's numbers were really focused in the services sector. Food and accommodation were just absolutely decimated. We've now begun to see that spread out into construction and manufacturing. It's still very much a services-driven recession. It's still very much women that are getting hit by this harder than men, which is going to have to inform how we respond from a policy perspective. But it's also, we need to look at that to try to understand how long is this recovery going to take? How long is it going to take us to start spending? How long will it take employers to start responding by bringing, sort of staff back in to respond to that increased consumer demand? This is not going to happen quickly.
Okay, one more question for you, and you addressed one of the things I was going to ask, which is, are we seeing it now beyond the services sector, which you talked about earlier, if you're seeing whether those job losses are far more widespread across other economic sectors? Bring up on the screen, if we could, the reaction so far, Peter, from the Prime Minister, tweeting that there are Canadians across the country who need our support. And the job numbers released today are a difficult but important reminder of that. We're doing everything we can to make sure you get the support you need right now and in the weeks and months to come. From a policy perspective, from the Prime Minister, from the Finance Minister today, what would we expect to hear today, Peter, after these numbers?
Well, what I would like to hear is a willingness to continue with the flexibility that they've shown. A lot of people have been frustrated that the programs keep changing and that it launches on one day as one thing and then 5 days later it changes into something else. A lot of that has been important policy flexibility. We're announcing these programs that would normally take months, if not years, to sort of research and implement and unveil. We've done them in a matter of days. And then the government has been, to its credit, fairly flexible in hearing that, well, that rent subsidy isn't going to be enough. The wage subsidy isn't going to be enough. The CERB isn't broad enough. And so they've shifted. And I think what we're looking at here, if indeed this is going to be a longer than expected downturn, and that it might take longer than we had expected for those employers to get people back onto their payrolls, then the government is going to have to be more flexible in terms of how it responds and what it does with sort of federal help and relief to people who have been laid off or have had their hours cut dramatically back. This isn't going to be just a matter of months anymore. I think the scar that is going to be left behind is going to be enormous, and Ottawa is going to need to be flexible to make sure that it addresses that.
Peter, thank you very much. I appreciate your insight this morning. Our senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong. Let's bring in Scott Peterson from here in our newsroom as we turn to the United States. So 2 million in Canada, you would expect, given the 10 times larger population in the United States, a proportionate loss. And indeed, again, just a devastating figure from the United States, Scott, in terms of the number of jobs lost and years of economic and jobs growth wiped out in the span of a month.
That's exactly what's going on. There's that old phrase that the markets and unemployment takes the stairs going up, but they take the elevator coming down. So there's a very quick deterioration of jobs in the U.S. and somewhat proportional, as you mentioned, that 10-to-1 ratio for Canada versus U.S. Take a look at the numbers because they are so large. 20.5 million jobs were lost in the U.S. just for the month of April alone. The unemployment rate spiking up to 14.7%. To put that in perspective, the unemployment rate was 10% at the worst of the 2008 recession. And for that kind of unemployment rate, we're going to go all the way back to 1933 when it was 25%. Now, digging into these numbers, all sectors were to the downside. We know the reason why, COVID-19, no one's going out. And we are now looking like the economy is going into a steep recession, whether we're looking at Canada or the U.S., and that becomes a political issue as the Prime Minister is tweeting out, and also we're hearing from the U.S. President as well, taking a look at these numbers, sort of putting them into context on Fox and Friends.
It's fully expected. There's no surprise. Everybody knows that. Somebody said, oh, look at this. Well, even the Democrats aren't blaming me for that. As president, we had the strongest economy in the history of the world, the strongest economy we've ever had, and we had to close it, which is artificial. We artificially closed it. Those jobs will all be back, and they'll be back very soon.
And to your point before, Heather, those jobs coming back anytime soon. Since the 2008 recession, there was about 20 million jobs created. So just over 11 years to create that amount of jobs being lost in 1 month. And if we look to the panacea of just a couple of months ago, in February, for example, the unemployment rate in the U.S. was at 3.5%. And man, oh man, those days seem like a long time ago.